The email landed at 9:12 on a Tuesday morning. I almost deleted it. Then I saw my mother-in-law's name beside the word manager on Northline's state business profile. My husband, Mark, had filed the change 6 days earlier without telling me. I was 36, and I had spent 11 years inside that company. Mark and I had built Northline from one laptop, a stack of samples, and more late nights than I could count. Diane Walsh had not built it with us. Yet her name now sat inside the official story of our business. The message came from Lee, our office manager. She had attached the latest state business update. "Can you confirm this is right before I update our records?" My stomach dropped before my mind caught up. Within 3 days, Mark would leave another document on my desk. That one would ask me to give Diane 20% of Northline. Mark was across town meeting a hotel contractor. He was also my husband of 12 years. For years, I thought our shared history made the company safer. That morning, it made the filing feel personal. I called Mark. He answered on the 4th ring. "Hey, I'm walking into a meeting." I asked why his mother's name was on our state profile, and he went quiet for half a second. Then his voice changed. It became gentle in the way he used when he had already decided I was overreacting. "It's just an administrative update," he said. "She has been helping me." I asked what she was helping with. He said vendor calls, scheduling, and a few family things. I reminded him that family things were not company authority. He sighed into the phone. "Erin, nobody took anything from you." That sentence stayed with me, and I had not accused him of taking anything yet, and I had only asked why his mother was listed on the business. Somehow, he was already defending himself against a charge I had not made. I told him not to sign or file anything else until we talked. His answer came too fast. "Of course." Then he added, "Please don't make this bigger than it is." I looked at Diane's name again. It was already bigger than he wanted me to believe. Northline was not a giant company, and we did not have investors or a glass tower. We had a workshop, a small office, 12 employees, and a reputation that took years to earn. We built tables, banquettes, and custom casework for restaurants and small hotels. Most of our growth came from repeat clients. I handled operations, pricing, scheduling, and production, and Mark was good at sales. He could walk into a half-finished dining room and make the owner see the finished space. I respected that gift, and it also meant he was used to selling a version of the future before anyone else had agreed to it. Diane had retired from a regional insurance office the previous spring. At first, her visits to Northline were harmless, and she brought coffee. She sat in Mark's office for an hour. She asked about our projects and told our staff how proud she was of him. I found it irritating sometimes, but not threatening. Then our marriage started to strain, and nothing dramatic happened at first. We were tired, busy, and too good at postponing difficult talks. Mark wanted Northline to grow faster. I wanted our systems to catch up before we added more debt and more staff. Every business argument followed us home. Diane noticed the distance before either of us admitted it, and she started calling Mark more often. She also started talking about Northline as if it were a family legacy. "This is what the Walshes built," she said one Sunday. I remember looking at Mark. He did not correct her. I had put more of my savings into the first year than he had. I had also kept my old project management job for 8 months while we built Northline at night, and Mark quit his sales job first. That had been our choice together, and I never used it as a weapon. Still, I noticed when our history got edited. First, Diane said Mark had taken a risk on himself, then she said he had created a company from scratch. By the time she started visiting the office twice a week, I sounded like someone who had joined after the hard part. I pushed back once at dinner. "We built it together," Diane smiled at me. "Of course you helped." Mark stared at his plate. That small silence hurt more than her words, and he knew exactly what she had erased. The state filing turned that old irritation into a new question. What had Mark changed when I was not looking? I opened our shared business drive. The recent folder held invoices, insurance certificates, and vendor forms. I found no ownership document there. Then I searched the state registry myself. Diane's name was visible to anyone, and she was listed as a manager. The update had been filed 6 days earlier. Mark's name appeared as the person who submitted it. My hands went cold, and a public filing did not automatically make Diane an owner. I knew that much. But it told me Mark had moved beyond talking, and he had put her name into the official story of our company without asking me. I printed the page and put it face down on my desk. Then I called Lee. I asked whether Diane had requested anything from her lately. Lee paused. "Do you mean besides access to the vendor calendar?" I sat straighter. "What access?" Lee said Mark had told her to create a temporary login. Diane had used it for about 2 weeks, and she had also asked for a copy of our open purchase orders, and Lee thought I knew. That was the part that scared me most. I told Lee not to change anything else until I spoke with Mark. I did not ask her to pick a side, and I did not want the staff trapped inside our marriage, but I asked her to forward any request that involved ownership, banking, or contracts directly to me. When I hung up, I had a clear problem. My husband had placed his mother inside the company in ways I had not approved. I still did not know why, and I also did not know how far he planned to go, and the answer would arrive sooner than I expected. Mark came back to the office after lunch. He closed my door behind him and stayed standing, which was unusual. Normally, he dropped into the chair across from me and stole whatever pen I was using. That day, he kept his hands in his pockets. I slid the printed state page toward him. "Why is your mother listed as a manager?" He glanced at it once. "I told you, she is helping." I asked who had decided she needed an official title. His jaw tightened. "It's not an ownership change." He said the words like a correction, and I told him I had not said it was, and I asked why he had filed her name without telling me. He looked past my shoulder toward the workshop. "Because every conversation with you turns into a veto." That was new. We had disagreed about expansion, but we had never agreed that secrecy was a substitute for consent. I asked him what I had vetoed. He named a second sales hire, a larger showroom, and a new finishing booth. I had not rejected all three, and I had asked for cash flow projections before the showroom, and I had asked whether the finishing booth would fit our lease. The sales hire had actually started 2 months later, and Mark knew that. I said, "You are turning normal business questions into a story where I stop you from doing everything." He rubbed his forehead. "You don't hear yourself anymore." I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny in the room. Then he gave me the explanation he had probably rehearsed. Diane had years of office experience, and she understood paperwork. She was available. She wanted to help. He needed someone he trusted, and every sentence sounded reasonable by itself. Together, they formed a different message. He trusted his mother more than his business partner, and he believed he could grant her a role first and explain it later. That was the part he kept stepping around. I asked whether Diane had any authority to sign for Northline. No. I asked whether she had access to our bank accounts. No. I asked whether she had seen payroll. He hesitated. Not payroll. That answer was not a no. What has she seen? I asked. He said open orders, vendor schedules, and some pricing, calling it harmless until I reminded him those were internal records. He said she was family. There it was again. Family had become a password. It was supposed to open every door without anyone asking who had issued the key. I had loved Diane for years, or at least I had tried to, and that did not make her my business partner. Mark finally sat down, his anger softened into exhaustion. "I need help, Erin." I asked why he had not asked me. "Because you would have made me justify every detail." I stared at him. "Yes, that is what partners do with each other." For a moment, he looked ashamed. Then his phone buzzed. Diane's name lit the screen. He turned it face down. I noticed that too. We agreed on one thing before he left my office. No further changes would be made until we reviewed the company documents together. Mark said yes. He even repeated it. Nothing else changes until we talk. I wanted to believe him. 12 years of marriage makes belief feel like muscle memory. You reach for the old version of the person before you examine the new evidence. I did that for another 2 days. On Thursday morning, Diane arrived before Mark with a tote bag and a travel mug, then walked past reception without signing in. Then she opened the small conference room and started arranging papers on the table. I stood in the doorway. "What are you working on?" She looked up and smiled. "Just cleaning up some vendor files for Mark." I asked who had given her those files, and she tapped the stack with one finger. "He did." I told her we had not approved outside access to internal records. Her smile disappeared. "Outside?" she repeated. "I'm his mother," I said. "You are not an owner or an employee here." The room went still. Diane had always been good at making silence feel like an accusation. She took a slow sip of coffee. "Mark said you were having trouble letting go of control." I felt something settle inside me. That sentence told me they had been discussing me as the obstacle. Not a partner with concerns, and not a wife in a strained marriage. An obstacle. I asked her to leave the files on the table. She refused at first. "He asked me to finish this," I said, "and I am asking you to stop." She looked toward the hall, as if Mark might appear and overrule me. He did not, and Diane placed the papers down one page at a time. "You know, Erin, not everything is a threat," I said. "Then it should be easy to tell me before it happens." She picked up her bag. At the door, she turned back. "Northline is Mark's life," I answered before I could soften it. "It is mine, too." She gave me a look that said she did not believe those were equal claims. After she left, I checked the papers. They were vendor purchase orders and pricing sheets, and nothing catastrophic was in the stack. That mattered, and I did not need to exaggerate what she had done. The violation was simpler. She had been given access after Mark promised me nothing else would change, and he had broken that promise in less than 48 hours. I called him. He said he had given Diane the papers before our conversation. That might have been true, and the dates on the printouts were from earlier in the week. I could not prove otherwise, so I did not accuse him of lying about that. I asked him to come back to the office. He said he could not. He was meeting a client. Then he added, "Please do not humiliate my mother in front of the staff." My grip tightened around the phone. I asked her to stop handling records she should not have. He said, "You made her feel like a criminal." I said, "You put her in a position she should never have been in." He went quiet. That afternoon, one of our longtime suppliers emailed me about a hardware order. His message began, "Diane said she can approve the substitution." I read it 3 times. Diane could not approve that substitution. More important, she had told someone outside Northline that she could. The title Mark had given her was already changing how people treated her. I forwarded the email to Mark, and he called within a minute. She was trying to help. I asked whether he had told Diane she could approve purchases. He said no. Then he said I was focusing on wording instead of intent. Intent was becoming his favorite hiding place. Every concrete act became harmless once he described the feeling behind it. Diane meant well. Mark felt unsupported. I was supposed to ignore the effect because the motive sounded warm. I wrote back to the supplier. I kept it professional, and Diane was not authorized to approve purchases, and all order changes still needed to come through me or Mark. The supplier replied with a quick apology. Then he forwarded the earlier message from Diane. Her signature block read, "Diane Walsh, Northline Tableworks Partner Relations." I had never seen that title. I had never approved it. The phrase made me laugh once, sharply, and partner relations sounded vague enough to mean nothing. It also sounded important enough to open doors, and that was exactly how this was being done. At home that night, I showed Mark the signature block, and he stared at it longer than he had stared at the state filing. I didn't tell her to use that. I believed him. That should have comforted me. It did not, and it meant he had created a role he could no longer define. Diane was filling in the blank herself. I asked him to remove her from the state profile. He said that was an overreaction, and I asked him to disable her company login, and he said she still needed it for a few tasks. I asked what tasks. He could not name one that required access, and instead, he changed the subject. Why are you making me choose between you and my mother? The question was so unfair that I went silent. I had not asked him to stop seeing her, and I had not asked him to reject her help at home. I had asked him not to install her inside a company we own together. He knew the difference. I said, "This is not wife versus mother. This is owner versus person who is not an owner." Mark stood up from the kitchen table. "You always make everything sound like a contract." I looked at him. "We are talking about a company." He shook his head and walked away, and the next morning, he left before I woke up. By Friday, the conflict had a shape I could explain in one sentence. Mark had brought Diane into Northline without my consent and was treating my objection as a personal defect. I still thought we could fix it with one honest meeting. Then Mark left a signature packet on my desk. The packet was clipped under a routine credit form. Mark had put a yellow tab beside my signature line. On top, he had written, "Need by Monday." I reached for my pen before a call from the workshop pulled me away. The interruption bought me a minute, and when I came back, I read the pages in order. The first two were ordinary, the third was not. It was titled as a written consent of the members, and the language was plain enough, and it proposed admitting Diane as a member of Northline. A second page showed the ownership split after the change. Mark and I would each hold 40%. Diane would hold 20%, and I stopped reading and sat very still. The state profile had not made her an owner. This document was meant to. My signature would make the plan possible under the agreement they had attached. I flipped back to the cover page, and there was no note saying ownership change. No email asking whether I agreed. Just a yellow tab and the words, "Need by Monday." I called Mark. He did not answer. I called again. Nothing. I walked into Lee's office with the packet. I asked whether she had assembled it, and she shook her head. "Mark printed that yesterday." I asked whether he had said what it was. Lee looked uncomfortable. He said it was the bank and governance stuff. Her answer was careful, and I could tell she did not want to be dragged deeper. I thanked her and took the packet back. The company did have a routine credit review coming up, and that was why the first pages looked familiar, and we updated our financial information every year. Mark had placed an ownership consent behind paperwork I expected to sign. Maybe he planned to explain it before Monday. Maybe he thought the tab was enough. I did not know. I only knew he had not told me yet. I sent him one message. I found the proposed membership change. "Do not file or circulate anything further. We need to talk today." He replied 6 minutes later. I was going to explain. I stared at the screen, then another message appeared. "Please don't spiral before you hear me out." That word did something to me. Spiral. It turned my reading into instability, and it made the document less important than my reaction to it. I wrote back, "I am reading what you printed." Then I stopped texting. Mark arrived just after 4. He came into my office and shut the door, and I had placed the packet between us. He looked at the yellow tab first. "I should have talked to you before I printed it." That was his opening. I asked whether the percentages were real, and he said they were a proposal. "Whose proposal?" I asked. He said his. Then he corrected himself. "Mine and Mom's, but mostly mine." I asked why Diane needed 20% of our company. He leaned forward. "Because she is putting time into this, and I need someone aligned with growth." There it was, not help. Alignment. I said, "You already have a business partner." He answered, "I have a business partner who says no to everything." I reminded him that we had expanded production twice in 3 years. He waved that away. After months of fighting. I asked if his solution was to dilute me until my vote mattered less. His face hardened. "It dilutes me too." He said it like proof of fairness, and I almost admired the logic. If he gave away part of his own power, I was supposed to ignore the fact that he was giving it to his mother. "She votes with you," I said. He did not answer. That silence answered enough. 40% plus 20% made a majority, and Mark did not need to say the number aloud. I asked whether that was the point. He stood up. "The point is that this company cannot freeze every time you get cautious." I told him the company was profitable because somebody had been cautious. He started pacing. "You always do this. You turn every idea into a risk report," I said, "and you just tried to turn your mother into a voting owner." He stopped. "Tried?" His eyebrows lifted. "I put a proposal in front of you." I pointed to the yellow tab. "You hid it inside a routine packet." I did not hide it. He was angry now. "It was right there," I said. "Then why didn't you say what it was?" Mark opened his mouth and closed it. He looked tired. For a second, I saw the man I had married instead of the opponent across my desk. Then he said, "Because I knew you would react like this." That erased the moment. I asked him one last question. "Did you tell Diane this was happening?" He looked at the floor. "She knows we are discussing it." I asked whether she knew the percentages. "Yes." My chest tightened. Diane had walked through our office, handled our records, used a title, and talked to vendors while believing she might soon own 1/5 of Northline. Her confidence suddenly made sense. I told Mark I would not sign. He laughed once without humor. "You haven't even heard the full plan." I said I had heard enough to reject the ownership change. He called me rigid. I called the proposal unacceptable, and neither of us raised our voice much. That made the scene worse. Before he left, Mark picked up the packet. I put my hand on it. "Leave it." He stared at my fingers. "It's my draft." I said, "It concerns my ownership. I am keeping a copy." He released it. That was the first time I saw real fear in his face. It was not fear of me. Fear that the conversation had moved from private persuasion to a record. I scanned the packet after he left, and I saved the scan to a folder only I controlled. Then I put the paper in my locked desk drawer. I did not feel clever. I felt embarrassed. I had reached for a pen before reading, because I trusted the person who had placed the tab. That night, Mark slept in the guest room. We barely spoke, and I lay awake thinking about the words he had used. Aligned with growth, cautious, rigid. Every one of them had been used before. I had heard them during arguments about equipment, hiring, and debt. The difference was that those arguments ended with a decision between two owners. This plan would change who got to make the decisions. On Monday morning, I drove to Northline before sunrise, and the workshop was quiet. I made coffee and sat at the long maple conference table we built in our second year. I remembered sanding that table with Mark until midnight, when we had been exhausted and broke, but still equal. Back then, equality was not sentimental. It was written down, and that thought sent me looking for the original company file. Our current legal folder lived on the shared drive, and the old paper records were different. I had boxed many of them when we moved offices 4 years earlier. I went to the storage room behind the sample library. There were tax boxes, old catalogs, and binders from our first projects. On the top shelf sat a blue accordion folder with a faded label, Northline Formation. The handwriting was mine. I pulled it down. Dust marked my sleeve. Inside were the original filing receipt, a stamped copy of our formation papers, our first operating agreement, and the bank deposit records from the year we opened. I sat on the floor and read. The formation paper listed Mark and me as the people managing the company at the start. It did not prove every ownership question by itself, and I knew that. The operating agreement did the more important work. It named Mark and me as the only members, and it stated our equal interests. It also said a new member could be admitted only with written approval from both existing members. I read that paragraph 3 times. The wording was not dramatic. It did not need to be. There was another section on major decisions. Neither of us could change the basic ownership structure alone. We had signed beneath it on the same day. My own signature looked younger, and Mark's was larger and messier. I remembered the cheap pen we had used because our good one was packed in a moving box. Behind the agreement was a capital schedule. It showed what each of us contributed at the start, and my contribution was larger. That did not make me more of an owner. Our agreement still said equal. I liked that fact. It kept me honest, and I was not trying to rewrite history in my favor. I was trying to stop Mark from rewriting it in his. The blue folder did not prove why he wanted Diane inside Northline. It did not prove he had committed some grand legal fraud. It proved something narrower and cleaner. We had made a rule together. He could not add a new member under that rule without my written consent. I called an attorney named Nora Chen from my car, and she had helped a friend with a business breakup. I did not ask her to attack Mark. I asked one question first. Can a public state listing make someone an owner if our operating agreement says something else? Nora said the public listing and ownership were separate issues. She told me not to treat a registry label as proof of membership. She also told me not to sign anything until she reviewed our documents. That advice calmed me more than any threat would have. The problem became smaller, and Mark had created confusion, access, and pressure. He had not erased my interest with one online filing. I emailed Nora the operating agreement and the proposed consent. I did not send private marital messages. I wanted business advice about business documents. She called that afternoon. Based on what you sent, your signature matters. She emphasized that she was speaking about our agreement, not making some universal rule. I appreciated that. I had no interest in turning my life into a courtroom speech. Nora suggested a simple next step: put my non-consent in writing. Ask that no one represent Diane as a member. Keep records, and do not destroy access or move company money in anger. That last part mattered. I was furious enough to imagine dramatic moves, and I did none of them. I sent Mark a short email. I copied Nora only after telling him I had counsel. I said I did not consent to admitting Diane as a member and would not sign the proposed amendment. I also asked him to correct any statement that described Diane as an owner. I did not demand that he surrender his own authority, and I did not claim more power than I had. Mark replied 2 hours later. Bringing lawyers into this is hostile. I read the sentence and felt strangely calm. He had brought his mother into our company. He had put an ownership amendment under a yellow tab. My asking someone to explain our agreement was apparently the hostile act. That evening, Diane called me for the first time since I had asked her to leave the conference room. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I answered. Diane did not say hello. I hear you hired a lawyer. Her tone suggested I had hired a private army. I asked a lawyer to read the documents, I said. Diane exhaled hard. You know what this is doing to Mark? I looked through my windshield at the dark parking lot. I was still sitting outside Northline, and I could see the blue folder on the passenger seat. Do you know what Mark asked me to sign? I asked. Of course I do. Her answer came without hesitation. That mattered. I asked when she first learned about the 20%. Diane said Mark had discussed it with her weeks earlier, and my hand tightened around the phone. Weeks earlier, before the state update, before the vendor login, before Mark told me she was just helping. Diane kept talking, and she said the company needed someone who would support Mark. She said he felt alone. She said I had become too controlling. I asked whether she understood that her share would give Mark and her a voting majority together. That is not how he explained it, she said. How did he explain it? Diane paused. He said you would all have a voice. I almost smiled, and that was technically true and practically evasive. I told her I would not sign. Diane's voice cooled. You are willing to damage your marriage over a percentage on paper? I looked at the folder beside me. No, I said. I am refusing to damage my ownership to make my marriage quieter. She called that selfish. I asked whether she would sign away part of something she had spent 11 years building. She said this was different because Mark was my husband. That answer told me more than she intended. Marriage, in Diane's world, increased his claim and reduced mine. I said being his wife is not the same as being his employee. Diane snapped, "Nobody said you were an employee." I told her I knew that. I was not borrowing another person's insult. I was drawing the line myself. Diane softened after that, and she said she had watched Mark carry stress for years. She believed I questioned him in ways that made him feel small. She believed he needed support. Some of that may have been true. I had become blunt. I had learned to ask hard questions quickly because one bad production promise could cost us a client. But none of that created a right to my ownership. I could admit my flaws without turning them into a transfer document. I told Diane the same thing. You can think I am difficult. You still cannot become my partner because Mark is tired of arguing with me. She went silent, then she said, "He built this company too." I answered, "Yes, that is why he already owns half of it." The call ended badly. There was no screaming. There was no dramatic insult. Diane simply said, "I hope you remember what family means when you are done winning." I sat there for several minutes after she hung up. Winning was another loaded word, and it made any boundary look like aggression. I drove home with the blue folder in my bag. Mark was in the kitchen, and he saw the folder before he saw my face. "Where did you find that?" he asked. I put my keys down. "Storage." His shoulders dropped. He knew exactly what it was. I asked whether he remembered signing the operating agreement. Obviously. I asked whether he remembered the section requiring both of us to approve a new member. Mark pulled out a chair. "That is why I asked you to sign." I stared at him. "You did not ask me." "You put a tab on it." He looked away. Then he said something honest. "I thought if you saw the whole package, you would realize it was not a big deal." I asked if that was why he put the ownership pages behind the credit form. He did not answer directly. "I was trying to avoid another fight," I said, "by arranging the fight after my signature." His face tightened. "You think the worst of everything I do now," I said. "I am describing what happened." Mark stood up and opened the refrigerator even though he did not take anything out. He stared inside for a few seconds. "I am scared this company is stuck," he said. His voice was quiet now. That was the first sentence all week that sounded like the truth. We sat at the kitchen table. For almost an hour, he explained his fear, and a larger competitor had opened a showroom nearby. 2 hotel groups wanted shorter delivery times, and our margins were good, but our growth had flattened. Mark wanted a bigger sales push and more risk. I wanted to protect the shop from commitments we could not fulfill. Those were real differences, and they deserved a real decision. I asked why Diane solved them. Mark rubbed both hands over his face. "She believes in me." The answer hurt because it was so small. I had believed in him when Northline had no clients. I had believed in him when we used our garage as a sample room. I had believed in him when our first major order arrived 6 weeks late, and we spent a weekend rebuilding it. But belief had changed meaning, and to Mark, belief now meant agreement. "I believe in you," I said. "I do not believe every idea you have is automatically safe." He laughed bitterly. "Exactly." I shook my head. "No, that is what partnership is." We talked until midnight. Nothing was solved. Still, I thought we had finally reached the real conflict. Then Mark asked me to consider a smaller share for Diane. I almost did not understand him, and he suggested 10% instead of 20%. He said we could limit certain decisions. I looked at him and felt the whole conversation collapse. His fear had been real, so had his plan. "This is not bargaining over a used car," I said. "The answer is no." Mark pushed his chair back. "Then what am I supposed to do when we deadlock?" I told him we could use a neutral business advisor, mediation, or a buyout discussion if our visions had truly split. He stared at me. A buyout? The word frightened him. I said, if you think we cannot run this company as equal partners, then we need to face that. Adding your mother is not a cure. He slept in the guest room again. The next week was the strangest in our marriage, and we went to work in the same building. We answered the same client emails. We discussed delivery dates. Then we went home and barely spoke. Mark stopped bringing Diane into the office. Her login remained active for 3 days, then disappeared from our system after I asked Lee to suspend unused outside accounts under our normal access policy. I documented the reason, and Diane was not staff, and she had no active assignment. Mark did not reverse it. That small result mattered. It showed he understood the access had gone too far even while he refused to admit it. The state listing remained. Mark said correcting it could wait. I disagreed, but I did not pretend the registry itself had transferred ownership. I kept repeating that distinction to myself, and a misleading label was serious. It was not magic. A few days later, a client named Owen called about a restaurant project. He had met Diane during one of her office visits. "Is she taking over some of your side?" he asked. I asked why he thought that. Owen said Diane had introduced herself as part of the ownership team. I felt heat rise into my face. "No," I said, "our ownership has not changed." That call gave the conflict a new cost. Mark's private experiment was now affecting our reputation. I asked Lee to pull every external email sent from Diane's temporary account. We did not read private mail, and it was a company account used for company work. There were 27 messages. Most were harmless scheduling notes. 4 used partner or ownership team in the signature or body. One told a supplier, "Mark and I are reviewing the purchasing structure." I printed those 4. When I showed Mark, he looked genuinely surprised. I did not know she was saying that. I believed him again. Believing him no longer fixed the problem. I said, "This is what happens when you give someone a title without defining the role." Mark read the messages twice. He called Diane while I was there. "Mom, you cannot call yourself an owner." I heard her voice through the phone, sharp but indistinct. Mark stepped into the hall, and he came back 10 minutes later looking drained. She thought the change was basically decided. I asked, "Why would she think that?" He said nothing. I waited. Finally, he said, "Because I told her I thought you would come around." That was another piece of the story. Diane had not invented her confidence. Mark had fed it. He had created an outcome in her mind before he had even asked me. I said, "You promised her part of my company before you had my consent." He flinched. "I did not promise." I held up the emails. She believed it was decided. Mark looked down. He said, "I was trying to build momentum." I laughed then. I could not help it. Momentum is not consent. That line ended the conversation. For the first time, Mark stopped calling the plan a misunderstanding. He started calling it a mistake, but he still wanted me to reconsider. The pressure shifted after that. Mark stopped pretending the idea had been casual, and he began arguing for it openly. He sent me a 1-page memo with his reasons. Diane could support vendor follow-up, and she could help with bookkeeping oversight. She could be a tie-breaking voice when we disagreed. That last line was the real proposal. The other duties could have been handled by an employee, and a tie-breaking owner was different. I wrote one sentence under it. A tiebreaker chosen by one of the 2 owners is not neutral. Then I sent it back. Mark did not reply. 2 days later, our bank asked for updated company records as part of the annual review on our credit line. The request was routine. What was not routine was the mismatch. The public profile listed Diane as a manager, and our operating agreement listed only Mark and me as members. The bank officer asked us to clarify the current management information before the review closed. She did not say who owned the company. She did not take a side, and she just wanted consistent records. Mark forwarded the message to me with 3 words. "This is why," I called him. "Why what?" He said the easiest solution was to complete the amendment and make the records match. I could not believe he had turned the mismatch he created into an argument for making it permanent. I said, "You changed the public information first. Now you are using the conflict as pressure to change the ownership." Mark said I was making it sound sinister. I told him it did not need to be sinister to be wrong. The bank gave us no dramatic ultimatum. We had time to respond. Still, Mark began treating Friday as a deadline because he wanted the credit review finished. He scheduled a meeting for Thursday afternoon, and he invited Diane. Then he sent me a calendar notice that said, "Finalize governance plan." I declined it. He walked into my office 5 minutes later. "Seriously?" I looked up from a production schedule. "I am not finalizing a plan I rejected." Mark leaned against the door. "Then come and say that to both of us." I almost refused again, then I understood what he was asking. He wanted one room where he could put the pressure in front of me. He believed I would soften if Diane was sitting there. He believed family discomfort would do what the yellow tab had failed to do. I changed my response to accepted. That afternoon, I met Nora at her office. I brought the blue folder, the proposed amendment, the public filing, and Diane's company emails. Nora read everything without drama, and she did not tell me I had won. She did not tell me Mark had lost. She said the documents supported a simple position. I had not consented to a new member, and the proposed amendment was unsigned. The state profile did not settle ownership by itself. She also pointed to something I had overlooked. The original operating agreement required written approval from both members for a change in membership. It also had a process for resolving major deadlocks. The process was boring. First, a formal meeting, then mediation if we still could not agree. After that, either owner could pursue a negotiated separation or whatever remedies were available under the agreement and law. There was no secret weapon. There was a path. I liked the path because it did not require me to destroy Northline to prove I mattered. Nora asked what I wanted. That question stopped me. For days, I had been focused on what I did not want, and I did not want Diane as an owner. I did not want Mark to hide decisions. I did not want my marriage used as leverage, but what did I want? I want the company to stay exactly as it is until Mark and I decide whether we can still run it together, I said. Nora nodded. Then say that. She suggested I put my position in writing before the Thursday meeting. I did. My letter was short, and I did not consent to Diane becoming a member. I did not consent to any dilution of my interest. I wanted the inaccurate public management listing corrected. I also proposed using the deadlock process in our existing agreement if Mark believed our management conflict could not be resolved. I sent the letter to Mark, and I copied Nora and our company bookkeeper. I did not copy clients or staff. Mark called within 10 minutes. "You are setting up a divorce through the business," he said. I closed my office door. "No, I am setting up a business process because you tried to solve a marriage problem with an ownership change." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You know, I never wanted to take the company from you." I believed that was probably true. The hardest part was realizing someone did not have to want to steal everything to justify protecting yourself. Mark wanted control. He wanted support. He wanted fewer arguments. He was willing to reduce my power to get those things. I said, "Intent is not the only thing that matters." He whispered, "I know." That was the first time he admitted it without adding a defense. The night before the meeting, we sat in separate rooms at home. The house felt too large. I opened the blue folder on the dining table. Inside, I found an old photograph tucked behind the formation papers. Mark and I were standing in our first rented workshop. I had a pencil in my hair. He had sawdust on his jeans, and between us was our first finished table. On the back, I had written, "First one out the door." I almost put the photo away. Then I looked at the formation receipt beside it. The receipt had our names on it, and so did the opening bank record. So did the first insurance form. The point was not that paper loved me more than Mark did. The point was that our beginning had been clear. We were two people making a risky thing together. Nobody had been waiting in the background for a future share. I put the photo back. Before leaving work, I took my copy of the amendment from the locked drawer and slipped it behind the old agreement. The folder now held both versions of Northline. The company we had created, and the company Mark wanted to create without an honest conversation. I decided I would bring it to the meeting. Before bed, Mark stood in the hallway outside the guest room. He looked exhausted. "Are you really going to say no in front of my mother?" he asked. I looked at him. "I already said no in private." He nodded slowly. "She sold some investments because she thought she would put money into the company." That was new. I asked whether he had requested that. Mark said no. Diane had moved cash because she believed the deal was coming. I felt bad for her. I also felt angry. "Did you tell her not to?" I asked. Mark looked away. He had not. I said, "Then tomorrow you need to tell her the truth about what was agreed and what was not." He rubbed his eyes. "She is going to blame me," I said. "She should not blame me for something I never promised." Mark gave a small, tired laugh. "You always know exactly where the line is." I shook my head. "No, I know where this one is." He went into the guest room. I stayed in the hallway for a while, and I did not feel victorious. I felt like I had finally stopped moving the line just to keep the peace. Thursday came with rain. I brought the blue folder back that morning and locked it in my desk. At 3:45, I took it out and closed my office door. The meeting was at 4. The conference room had one glass wall and one wall of wood samples. Rain tapped the windows. Diane was already there. Mark sat across from her. A fresh copy of the ownership amendment lay on the table with a pen beside it. No lawyer was present. No banker was there to referee us. I had asked for that. This decision belonged to the people who had created the problem. Diane looked at the blue folder under my arm. "So we are doing paperwork now?" I sat across from them. "We have been doing paperwork for weeks." Mark pushed the amendment toward me, and the split was still 40-40-20. "I think this is the best path," he said. Diane folded her hands. "Can we talk like family before this turns into a legal performance?" I set the folder down. "Family is why this got this far." She leaned toward me. "Nobody is trying to erase you," I asked. "Then why does this reduce my ownership?" "It reduces Mark's too," she said. Mark nodded. "Exactly. I had heard that argument before. It reduces each of us on paper. Then it gives the new share to the person who agrees with you." Mark's jaw tightened. "You don't know that Mom will always agree with me." Diane looked offended. "I can think for myself." "I know," I said. "That is why I do not want you deciding the future of a company you did not build." Diane's face hardened. "I raised the man who built half of it." I nodded. "And he already owns half." Mark pushed the pen away. "This is what I mean. Every conversation becomes a wall." I opened the blue folder. First came the original formation record, then the operating agreement, then the opening capital schedule. "Do you remember these?" I asked. Mark barely looked down. "Yes." I placed the unsigned amendment beside them. "Then you remember we chose equal ownership. You also remember a new member needs written approval from both of us." "I know what it says." "Good, then this is only a proposal unless I agree." Mark's voice sharpened. "Nobody said otherwise." I touched the yellow tab beside my signature line. "You put this behind a routine credit form. You wrote, 'Need by Monday.' You never told me it changed ownership." I said I handled that badly. "No, you said I reacted badly." Diane turned toward him. "You told me she knew we were discussing it." Mark went still. I looked at Diane. "I knew you were helping with some office tasks." I did not know about the 20% until I found the packet. Diane stared at him. "You said she was resisting the details." Mark rubbed the edge of the table. "I thought she would agree once we had a full plan." "You told me it was basically settled," Diane said. "I said I thought it would be." The room changed. For weeks, Mark had given each of us a different version. I was the difficult holdout, and Diane was only temporary help. Both stories protected him from a direct conversation. Diane pushed her chair back. You knew I moved money because I thought I was investing. Mark looked at her. I never told you to sell anything. You knew I did. He closed his eyes. I did not rescue him. Diane turned to me. So what now? You just say no and everyone lives with it. On this ownership change, yes. She stared at me. You make it sound cold. It is a business decision. It is our family. No, it is a company with employees, vendors, and contracts. Family feelings do not replace consent. Mark gave a bitter laugh. There is the risk report again. I looked at him. You used to value that I saw problems before they cost us money. That was before every idea felt like a trial. Then tell me you want a different partner. Do not install your mother as a jury. He looked at me for a long time. I placed Diane's 4 company emails beside the public listing. This is already affecting how people understand Northline. Diane looked down. I was told it was happening. I believe you. That surprised her. I believe Mark gave you reason to think that. It still does not make you an owner. Mark stared at the folder. The state listing does not prove membership, I said. These emails do not prove it. The unsigned amendment does not create it either. Diane crossed her arms. You hired a lawyer to tell you that? I hired a lawyer to make sure I did not claim more than our documents support. Then I pulled out the old photograph from our first workshop. Mark smiled before he could stop himself. I forgot about that. I didn't. On the back, my old handwriting said, first one out the door. Diane's expression softened. You two were babies. We were tired, I said, and broke. Mark looked at me, and happy. Sometimes. I put the photo beside the agreement. This is not about pretending you did nothing, Mark. You built this with me. I know what you carried. I also know what I carried. Diane said, he needs someone who believes in him. I turned to her. I believed in him when there was nothing to believe in except his word. That does not mean I owe him agreement forever. She looked away. Mark picked up the new amendment. What would you do instead? It was the first real question he had asked me in weeks. If we cannot manage Northline together, we use the process we already agreed to. We meet, we mediate. If our visions are still different, we discuss a buyout or another separation. Diane looked alarmed. You would break up the company over this? No. I would rather face the real disagreement than hide it under a third owner. Mark said, what if Mom had a smaller non-voting interest? No, Erin, no, his voice hardened. You will not consider anything. I will consider a defined job if there is a real business need and we both approve it. I will not give her ownership. Diane drew back. I am not applying for a job in my son's company. Then we agree on that too. Mark stood so fast his chair rolled back. My mother's name is Walsh too. There it was, not growth, not bookkeeping, not neutrality, name, belonging, entitlement. He pointed toward the workshop. This is my family business. I stood too. It is our business. I never said it wasn't. You did when you made her belonging more important than my consent. Diane said, she is your wife. Why is she talking about consent like you are strangers? The room went cold. I looked at Mark. He did not correct her. I took the written notice from the blue folder. It said I did not consent to admitting Diane as a member. It also asked that the public management listing be corrected and invoked our existing deadlock process. I signed it. Then I slid a copy to Mark. His eyes stayed on my signature. You came here planning to do this. Yes. So this meeting was never real. This meeting is real. The ownership proposal ended when I said no. Diane stood. After everything Mark has done for you, you cannot give his mother one piece? My old instinct rose. Explain more. Soften the refusal. Make the room comfortable. I let it pass. I was family when he needed my money, my clients, and 11 years of my work. I did not stop being an owner when you decided you wanted my chair. Diane went completely still. Mark stared at me. I had not raised my voice. I did not need to. Diane picked up her purse. I never wanted your chair. I pointed to the amendment. Then you do not need my share. She turned to Mark. Did you know she was going to refuse? He looked down. Yes. Then why did you let me come? His answer was quiet. I thought she might change her mind with you here. Diane laughed once. It sounded wounded. So you used me too. Mom, no, she held up her hand. You did. Then she left. The glass door clicked shut. Mark and I sat in silence. Finally, he said, You made your point. No, I made my decision. He looked at the blue folder. What happens now? We correct the public record. We tell the bank ownership never changed. Then we use the process in the agreement. And us. I took a breath. We stop using the company to avoid talking about us. His eyes filled. He looked away. That was the hard part of a clean boundary, and it did not erase love. It only stopped love from doing a job it could not do. Mark picked up the original agreement and ran a finger over his signature. I remember signing this. So do I. We thought we were protecting ourselves from some imaginary investor. We were protecting ourselves from any future we had not both chosen. He nodded. Then he looked at the proposed amendment. I am sorry I put it in the packet. I waited. He added, I hoped you might sign before we had another fight. There it was. Not a perfect confession, just the truth. That was not okay, I said. I know. For once, he did not add a defense. Mark drew a line through the proposed ownership schedule. He wrote, withdrawn, and signed beside the word. His signature was not required for my refusal. It was not a magic cure. It was visible. The proposal was over. I will submit the correction to the state profile tomorrow, he said. I want a copy. You will get one. I put the original agreement back into the blue folder. At the door, Mark stopped and looked toward the workshop. I told Mom this would make her part of what I built. I waited. He swallowed. I should have said what we built. That apology did not fix our marriage. It did restore one fact. For that day, it was enough. Mark submitted the correction the next morning, and he copied me on the confirmation. The public profile changed back after the state processed it. Diane's name disappeared from the management listing. We also sent the bank the operating agreement and a short explanation. Ownership had not changed. The bank finished its routine review without becoming part of our family dispute. Inside Northline, we made one change immediately. Outside access now required a written business reason and an end date. That rule applied to everyone, not just Diane. Mark and I started the deadlock process in our agreement. The first meeting was awkward. The second was worse. Then we brought in a neutral mediator and stopped pretending every business disagreement was really about love. We did not save the old version of our marriage, and by winter, we had decided to separate. That hurt more than the ownership fight. It also felt more honest. We did not rush a sale or punish the company. Mark and I kept our equal interests while we worked toward a structured buyout. The employees kept their jobs, and clients kept their projects. Diane stayed away from the office. For months, she did not call me at all. Then she sent one brief message near Christmas. I should not have called myself an owner before you agreed. There was no excuse after it. I answered, Thank you for saying that. That was all. Mark and I became better business partners once we stopped demanding that the business repair the marriage. Strange, but true, our meetings got shorter. Our decisions got clearer. He still wanted faster growth, and I still asked hard questions. Now we wrote down the disagreement instead of recruiting family members into it. The blue folder stayed in my office safe. One afternoon, Lee brought me a new client file and noticed it on the shelf. That old thing saved you, didn't it? She asked. I thought about that. No, I said. It reminded me what we had already agreed. Paper did not save me. A lawyer did not save me. The bank did not save me. The important moment was simpler. I read the document before I signed it. I trusted my own no, then I kept saying it after the room became uncomfortable. Months later, I opened the blue folder to add the final copy of the corrected state record. The old photograph slipped out again. Mark and I were still smiling in that first workshop. I did not hate those people, and they had built something good. I placed the photograph behind the original filing and closed the folder. The company had not become less mine because my marriage changed. Diane had not become an owner because Mark wanted an easier vote. And family had stopped being a word that could open every locked door. Now it needed permission.